Hello, I'm Lori Kimball, Senior Manager of Programs here at Oatlands. We are a site of the National Trust for Historic Preservation located south of Leesburg in Loudoun County, Virginia. Oatlands is on the unceded and ancestral lands of the Piscataway and the Manahoac and other nations whose history we are still learning. Oatlands was a site of enslavement and had the dubious distinction of being the largest plantation in Loudoun County in both enslaved labor and land. Our mission today is to recognize and honor these people who came before us and to tell a full and accurate story about that history. Amplifying Indigenous women's voices, Native American slavery in Loudoun County, builds on county and state court cases to show how Indigenous people, in these examples all women, fought for their freedom from slavery. Many did so during the time that our country was fighting for its freedom from England, a freedom for many people, but not all. This program is part of a three-part series made possible in part by a grant from the Virginia 250 Commission in partnership with Virginia Humanities. 2 other programs will be held in the first part of 2025. Keep checking our website at oatlands.org for dates and times. All 3 programs will be live streamed and recorded for future viewing on Oatlands' YouTube channel. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Alicia Cohen from the Black History Committee. She's going to be followed by Eric Larson, the manager of the State Records Room, and then we're going to turn it over to our presenters to start the program. So welcome, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to make sure I'm standing in the Black History Committee and a member of the Loudoun, Virginia 250. That's the Revolutionary War Commemoration Committee. The Black History Committee being represented today, we're so excited to be partners with this program, showing our support of and honoring our Indigenous brothers and sisters in their quest for continued freedom and respect during the Revolutionary period and today. Do you know that 1924 this year of Native American citizenship? But you must note that they were not given the vote at that time. So I hope you will dig deeper and find out more about that. At our table, we'll have information, a couple of books. We'll have information on African Americans during the Revolutionary War, and we have books that we've published, and we hope you'll take a look at them and buy them if possible. But I want to say that for any of you who are interested in what are many of the communities, Native American communities within Virginia, I do have a Native leaders are working with the Virginia 250, and they are advisory council. And if you ever wanted to know what are some of, without Googling, if you ever wanted to know what are some of the communities, feel free to take a look at the sheet. So with that, thank you. We welcome you here. We know that this is part of everyone's learning effort, and I hope you keep learning.
Good afternoon. I'm Eric Larson. I'm the Historic Records Manager for the Clerk of the Circuit Court. And on behalf of Gary Clemens, who is the Clerk of the Circuit Court, he welcomes you all today to this exciting event. I've worked with Oatlands, or we should say Historic Records has worked with Oatlands on so many events that deal with African American history, but now we're working in the realm of Native American history. Records, I hate to say, are far and few between in the county court records that actually mention or describe Native American. Our display today is actually most of the case that they will please come over and take a look at that afterwards. Also in your packet, if you want to know what records we have in our collection, there's 3 brochures in there that describes a whole course of records that you may be interested in. We have all of our records from 1757. Loudoun County records were not destroyed until 1865, so they came back. So in the realm of free blacks and slavery, we have thousands upon thousands of documents on that. Most of it is digitized, so you're welcome to come in, take a look at them. But please look online too, because we do have spreadsheets as well. You can do a lot of research online. If you have any questions, just please email me. I also have a staff member here, Shannon Fuller. He's part of my staff. We will get back with you on your request, and copies of said that we would give them to the public free. That was part of the grant obligation. So I welcome you all today. Please enjoy. If you have any questions, come see our exhibit afterwards. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Rene Locklear White, and I am a Lumbee Indian, Lumbee Native American, an Indigenous woman from North Carolina. Our tribe is the largest tribe east of the Mississippi River, and you weren't supposed to know about us, and that's probably why you've never heard of us. I'm born on our Lumbee River, and I'm very proud to be a Saddle Tree Swamp resident. Our river is very important to us. We have an intricate kinship between our people and our river, and it creates a special unity that we have among our people. We are people of the dark water, y'all. I've lived in Virginia for 23 years, so I'm a dual citizen. I'm a resident of North Carolina and I'm a proud resident of Virginia. I'd like to thank Lori for inviting us to speak today.
My name is Dr. Sheri Huerta. I'm an adjunct faculty in the Honors College at George Mason University. And at George Mason University, I teach courses related to the history of Loudoun County teachers, how to teach the history of slavery in their classes. And I've been fortunate to take my research on the lives of enslaved and free people of color in Virginia to many different public venues as well as professional conferences. And it is just a pleasure to be here with you today. And I really love being here with Rene, and thank you, Lori, for making this happen.
And I love being here with you, Sheri. We are standing on Indigenous land. You have land acknowledgement statements in the papers that you are next to there. And if you'd like to read the tribes that are nearest here, and in that statement it also tells you some other things that you might not know you didn't know. History tells us that Africans were enslaved and that Indigenous Native American people died off, assimilated, or moved to a reservation. This oversimplification, in my opinion, is sinful. When the colonizers or the invaders arrived, Native American women in what is called erasure, suffering severe social and economic repercussions while marginalizing our Native American women and within our own people.
Our goal here today is to build a deeper understanding of this complex and contested history of Indigenous slavery and the fight for freedom and identity. We're going to do this by sharing stories, by introducing you to some of the historical records, and by interpreting Virginia's colonial and state records through both historical and cultural perspectives. So, our game plan for today.
This is our next slide is the agenda. We're going to talk about some Indigenous people and their claim for freedom in court. We're going to look at Loudoun cases and then talk about Indigenous identity and advocacy. And then we're going to open up for questions. If you have to talk about anything, that will be a good time. The agenda that I just talked about. You'll see it several times through this presentation. Whoop. Okay. We are still here. We were here, and we're still here. And this map embodies that story. This is a map by my friend Erin Perpelli. I have some maps here to take home with you today if you'd like. This tribal map takes a snapshot between 50, but look how populated it is. The next slide is a quote by an author, Andres Resendez, in his book, The Other Slavery, The Uncovered Story of Indian Enslavement in America. Across America, to the 19th century, we're thinking that number might be between 2.5 million and 5 million slaves. This slide of Virginia was also made by my friend Erin Capelli. Before the English settlement of Jamestown in 1607, Virginia had many tribes. On this map, you see names that are larger, that Indigenous people weren't there. For example, in Chief Powhatan Confederacy was a chief Algonquian-speaking family group. There's 3 language groups here that we know of. Algonquian-speaking types of lifestyles that people made were through the woman's lineage. The women were recognized as vital roles in their family and their community. We fostered leadership for our women. We promoted gender equality through our women, and we ensured that the transmission of our culture and our knowledge and our tradition followed through those matrilineal lines. The men were equally important. They had different roles. They protected the communities. The men would have gone out and taken some native captives. I didn't say slaves. They took enemies captive. These could, as a way of giving them to another group as a form of alliance. They could have been used as a form of a religious practice or ceremony, or incorporated in a sort of ceremony of those nations. All of these are under the context of culture. Our actions with each other was based on a cultural context. At contact, everything changed. During contact and the invasion, there's a difference between war, captives, and purchasing human beings and human trafficking. I think we could all agree on that. Columbus was in the business, and then there was exchange for bodies for guns and bodies for horses. And the European slaving escalated the slavery here, taking native enemies captive, and introduced different concepts of slavery that our people were even unaware of. It drove the Indian slave trade during those times. It was a relentless demand to have furs and to have native humans. And the demand exceeded the natural order, and it was unsustainable. There's an interconnectedness of that escalated warfare, raiding of slaves, and disease epidemics among our people. Our numbers reduced, and that was the interconnectedness. There was a higher value that was placed on Native women, higher than anyone. Just interesting to me that today Native American women serve in the military at higher rates than any other demographic. I'm a retired military veteran, y'all. And it's interesting to me that our Native women were bought and sold at very high rates. Their ability to do labor, their reproductive potential to give birth to more Indian slaves. They were exploited, dehumanized. The premium price was 50% to 60% higher than Indian males. There was no doubt some type of sex trafficking involved in that purchase price. That they want her because she can provide more assets to include weaving, food planting and gathering, child rearing. Those types of Indian children were easily to teach English to. So they were also had a high value, premium value.
So this really sort of emphasizes the tensions, these cultural conflicts between how Indigenous people understood enslavement as war captives and human trafficking and purchasing, through what the English settlers were thinking about their laws and what they saw and what they wanted to accomplish with their slavery system. So there are many different laws that affected the relationship between the English and the Indigenous people in terms of enslavement. We see here that one of the first treaties that was put together was in 1646. And this was after a series of really devastating Anglo-Powhatan wars. And this treaty decided that, and the English settlers, but also part of this was an understanding that if any of the runaway enslaved people or indentured servants from the English territories, if they had wandered into Powhatan areas, that the Powhatans would return them. So there already this expectation that English slavery would be upheld by other tributary nations. Another important part of this treaty was that it allowed the Indigenous children to freely go back. As Rene was mentioning, that they would bring the Indigenous children in. They would teach them English. They would quote unquote civilize them, a word that is dripping with colonial effects. And they would convert them to Christianity, all seen by the English as a positive good. The problem came that part of the treaty that said that the children could go back didn't always happen. And this led to more conflicts when the indigenous people wanted their children back and they weren't being given back. So there's also then a question about, into Virginia specifically for enslavement, and what would the status of their children be? And Virginians had to think about that. And this didn't only affect the African enslaved people, but also indigenous enslaved people. Would their children be free? Would their children not be free? And so the 1662 law was put in place to talk about this. And I'm going to talk about that more later. We also see that there's a provisions of thinking about who was enslavable. By 1670, Virginia legislators thought that those people enslavable were those who were brought into the colony by shipping, emphasizing that they'd probably come from the transatlantic slave trade. And they also focused on those who were not Christians as being enslavable. After Bacon's Rebellion, there was even further clampdown on indigenous people, and 1682 made really the first Virginia law that specifically said that indigenous people could be enslaved for life. This was not just the previous provision that maybe they were only enslaved for 12 years, this was for life. But then things changed again. By 1691, English wanted to legitimize the trade that they were putting together with indigenous traders. And of course, it didn't make legal sense if you could trade with someone who was also enslavable. Indigenous people could be enslavable. By 1705, as later magistrates and lawyers and judges would argue, the 1705 slave codes focused on those enslavable or the people that are being shipped into Virginia. And this pretty much meant that enslavement of indigenous Virginia law is not possible.
Before you move to the next slide, Sheri, may I point out that something else that was happening here in Virginia in 1632, there was a treaty. It ended the Second Anglo-Powhatan War, and it was one of the first attempts to separate Indian people from English people. And the remnants of the Powhatan Virginia, so England, the Crown, the agreement for the reservation is actually with the Crown. Imagine that. This is before the United States became the United States. So in 1642, the Pamunkey Reservation was established. In 1650, the Mattaponi Reservation was established.
And the establishment of reservations was part of recognizing legally an indigenous identity. And in this section, we want to kind of shift into thinking about having these laws about slavery and freedom for indigenous people. How did this really play out in the court system? And we see that from almost the beginning of enslavement in Virginia, that people were taking their claim to court saying that they shouldn't be enslaved. Two really early cases we have access to is a case from 1644 of a man identified as mulatto Manuel, and in 1655, the more famous case of Elizabeth Key. Now, both Manuel and Elizabeth Key are using the arguments that they had been baptized and that should be other Christians, right? But then also, in Elizabeth Key's case, she was born of an African mother and an English white father. And she's arguing that as of the common law procedures of England, that because her father was white and free, that she should also be considered free. But then, of course, the law about who your mother was and who your father is going to change. Now, freedom suits are also including indigenous people who are taking their claims to court. And two of the early cases we have from the Library of Virginia is a case in 1747, almost 100 years later, from a man who was identified as Indian Will. And he was in Northampton County, and he is arguing that because he had indigenous background, he should have a right to claim his freedom. Same thing in 1752 with Anne Williams. She also was saying...
May I speak to something about baptisms? The baptisms were part of the discovery doctrine that was set in the colonizers, the invaders, the mercenaries, had the rights, the legal rights under God to kill you, take your home, and do things. So getting a baptism was easy instead of dying. My people, my Lumbee people, are very Christian. We built our own churches of Indianness just by baptizing us. I also wanted to mention that these names, these last names, we didn't have last names. We didn't have indigenous last names. And look at these English biblical names, these English names. These were given to us. We were renamed. Our children's names were taken to be renamed. And then look at Will, Indian Will. There's no recognition of his full name. doubtful he was a will. And just to be called Indian minimizes us and takes us away from our tribe. You can call me Indian, the will is, and we weren't supposed to know. That's part of the assimilation and the erasure.
And I said that a part of these freedom cases was proving who your parent was. Now, Elizabeth Key could see that because her parent was a white English man, that she was entitled to freedom. But after 1662, the law in Virginia stated that that child would have the condition of its mother. And this was a huge shift in English thinking. So if the mother was indentured, the child would also be born indentured and have to serve an indentured contract. If the mother was enslaved and African, then that child would be, mother was enslaved or indentured at the time of the child's birth, and that child would have that same status. But this law is one that is set in motion so many questions about identity and status, and one that particularly Indigenous people had to pay attention to because now they had to know their maternal history and that cultural history and understand that family tradition. So I want to take us into one of the really most important, significant cases about Indigenous identity and freedom in Virginia. And this is the 1772 case related to the Coleman family. Now, these were a group of Indigenous people who were purchased by a white man named Francis Coleman sometime in the early 1700s. The enslaved people kept that last name Coleman as a marker of their identity, and they kept that heritage of being Indigenous with them. We see here in a runaway slave advertisement from 1771, one of the members of the Coleman family, and he has already made known and made public that he was Indigenous. And his enslaver is pointing that out. His enslaver was John Hardaway, saying, and this is pretty remarkable that now that he's kind of making people aware that if you were Indigenous, you could claim your freedom. Imagine how many enslaved people are hearing their enslavers talk about this, that are hearing this read about, that are hearing the stories about other people who have run away and making a claim that their origins up to the state court level. And this is pivotal because in many ways, first of all, there's 12 people of the Coleman family coming together saying that they are all descended from a woman very well known and had the reputation of being called Indian Judith. And because of that reputation, that established her identity as Indigenous. Now, these plaintiffs are not going into the court alone. They have a lawyer who's appointed to speak for them. And in this case, the lawyer was Thompson Mason of Loudoun County. And Thompson, quick fact check here, quick quiz question if you were my students, is the younger brother of which into his understanding of legal history, and also with the help of Thomas Jefferson, who was taking notes and kind of doing some of the fact checking for him. Because at that time, these published cases weren't always published. They weren't always available to everyone. You had to be sitting in that courtroom or know someone who was there to know about the history of these cases.
May I say something about Thomas Jefferson? Thomas Jefferson, I love a lot of things that Thomas Jefferson has brought about. But there's a lot of things that you may not know that he was doing in the background. I've seen letters that he's written to Native American Indian chiefs saying, you will be our brother, we are going to have friendship, this is what we're going to do. And then you see a letter, same day, sent to a white fraternal leader to deal with them. We will kill the Indian to save the man. We are your friend. So there was a lot of that going on in the background, trickery.
And in these court cases, it became then apparent that Mason is looking at these laws, not only because he has to argue in front of other jurists and other judges, even though fully understanding the local customs and traditions that continued Indigenous enslavement. And so Mason is specifically focusing on this period between 1682, when enslavement that legalized trade law meant that you couldn't enslave Indigenous people. And specifically, he's going to focus on that shipping aspect. Indigenous people were not shipped to Virginia, they were brought mostly on the land, or at least could make that argument. And this argument stuck. And the case of Robin V. Hardaway and the case of getting the freedom for the Coleman family members continued. There are at least 4 different cases of Coleman family members, not just in Didwinnie County, but also Henrico County, in Kentucky, and later in another county. It was finally when her enslavers were too old and too tired of fighting back to come in the court that they said, that's it, we're going to free you. Why this is important is if you free one child and descendant of an enslaved person, you free all of the descendants of that person, as long as they could take that to court and prove that they were related to that person. So there are ripples, even though we're in the era of the 1770s, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, Revolutionary War, there's also that consideration of what is this going to do to our system of slavery. The Colemans returned to the courthouse, and another set of descendants who argue. But now it's been about 20 years, and jurists and magistrates are a little concerned that, wait a minute, maybe the proof of the indigenous people of their family history isn't enough to support the evidence needed in court. Now the evidence was starting to rest upon white witnesses who knew of the ancestor, who knew of the ancestor's relationship, who knew what the ancestor looked like, or who knew how this ancestor became enslaved. And that white testimony became then the primary and the focusing on the 1705 laws. And that's key because if you had been brought and enslaved in 1695, for example, the court might say, no, that law wasn't changed until 1705. So people are also thinking about when are they going to have their story of when they became enslaved, and there's some strategic negotiations there. So we have the shifting of who knowledge is.
May I ask a question about, on that slide, the foreign slaves, foreign Indians. I'm wondering if that came from the notion that Native American people, and we have a government-to-government relationship with the United States, with the colonies, or with the states. We had trade agreements, we had treaties, and then were kept. We had treaty arrangements because we were a sovereign country of people in and of each individual language group, each tribe. So I'm wondering if, when they say foreign, they're talking about it could have been someone from West Virginia area or North Carolina, being foreigners of this area, but still in this country.
That they weren't taken, maybe they were just taken from the tributary nations that were aligned with Virginia, and that they hadn't come from some other place outside of Virginia. So again, I feel like this will be a common to break away from those ripples.
Some of these laws that we started out with talking about were when Virginia was a colony. And then when Virginia becomes a state, things look different. When Virginia, let me just throw this in here. We're still talking about the past, but in 1950s, there was a new policy in the United States called the termination policy. And the United States was tired of all of this, just wanted to get out of the Indian business, and started terminating tribes. My tribe was one of those tribes that was on the block to be terminated, even though we had been seeking our federal recognition and fight for our rights to get a Lumbee Act passed. So we have a Congressional Lumbee Act that recognizes us as Lumbee people, but without the federal benefits because the government was getting out of the Indian business in the 1950s.
And I think that word terminate really kind of resonates with the continuing of these laws, because each time that they raise a different standard for proof, they're terminating aspects of that identity of Indigenous people. They terminated the importance or the significance of Indigenous people telling their own family history, descended from a woman known as Butterwood Nan, who was Indigenous. And at this time, the evidence shifted again from what white people knew about the enslavement of relatives or the enslaved people, to now they're focusing on the physical features. How could someone tell if someone was Indian? How could someone tell if they were of Indigenous background? And they focused on things like, was there long, black, straight hair? From the Hudgens case, one of the questions is, was there... And so again, they're relying on different kinds of information. Now it's turning solely to appearance.
Sheri, I'm sure you know anthropologists have not always been our friend. We've had a lot of anthropologists come among our people, put a pencil in our hair to see if the pencil falls out or does it stay in our curly hair or our straight hair, what color our skin is. This happened among my people, and it definitely happened here in Virginia.
And along with this increasing these restrictions and these tensions is that, let's face it, bottom line, enslavers are worried about losing their rights to their enslaved property. If you free one enslaved female, you're going to free generations of her family. And you can also go back and find other generations, and that's exactly what was happening here. There's also then, of course, the jurists and magistrates could say, well, as people are getting, could be used in the trial to say that memory and the aging information of older witnesses became suspect as well. So we have then, again, whenever there's kind of a constriction, there's also then maybe some protections that are thrown in. In 1795, Virginia creates a law that codifies what a freedom suit could be and what was the procedure for freedom suits. Now, freedom suits were not only for people of indigenous background, they were also for someone who may have, their mother perhaps was indentured, and that child as they were growing up, their indenture was never canceled, and they ended up being kind of perpetually enslaved. Or for people of African descent who had been transported into Virginia against the 1778 non-importation law. Each of those people, each of those groups had different reasons for filing for the recovery of their freedom. And so by 1795, there's also that added little spicy element of abolition societies, particularly reaching out to people who could be really favorable candidates for freedom suits. And because there's this number of freedom suits that are now kind of flooding in the courts, and abolition societies are being too influential. So now they put in a provision that anyone assisting a plaintiff in their effort to recover their freedom could be fined up to $100 if that freedom case failed, as a way to kind of slap back and discourage this from happening. Alongside that, though, they continued to represent that they were focused on the rights of people to bring that case to court, to say that they should. And we see this happening where an enslaved person may have heard, may have understood the law, may know their family history. They would take that history to a county magistrate, a justice of the peace. That justice of the peace was then required to issue a summons to that enslaver to come in and answer those charged financial bond, saying that if they do not allow the enslaved person to come into court to make their case, to make their claims, to witness, interview witnesses, then the enslaver was liable to pay money back to the state of Virginia. Now, if the enslaver was not willing to do that, not willing to post a bond, then that enslaved person could be taken into custody by the sheriff. And we know this happened for a year or 2 years, a county court, to represent free of charge to the indigenous person. So you can make your own interpretations about what that selection might mean. So we want to highlight some of the local cases that are taking place here in Loudoun. We have a lot of the documents in the other room. The first ones that I found in looking through these records come from 1793, where we have 4 women, 3 are shown here, who are, we have Rosanna, we have Athene, we have Diana, and each of these 3 women were enslaved by someone who was related to the Skillman family. So there's a family tie there. We also have then this next one of a woman named Esther, who was also had connections with the Skillman family. And I wanted to point out the language of what is written in the court records, that she is identified as Esther, an Indian woman, and she is in the possession of, not enslaved by, in the possession of an enslaver. She has an income. And I know there's some.
This is a good example of a lady named Esther. That's a very biblical name. Indian woman. We know she's a woman, but we don't know what tribe she's from. That's been lost. And when we can conclude that when a person has been removed from their people, they've got a disconnect from their family heritage. They might, over time, if they're young, they won't remember their language. So they can't speak, one more generation, their child won't be able to speak their native tongue. And that's one of the requirements to be considered Native American and Indigenous, is that you have a language and you have to speak it. But we were prevented from speaking our language and prevented from education for a long time. So you start to see some of those examples.
So none of those 4 cases, it seems like, none of them would...
Can I clean that up?
Oh, yeah.
Our women are educated. What I'm trying to say is learning the English education system and being able to understand that and maneuver that. Because we were all smart in our own cultures, but not to this new thing. And that's what I mean. I wanted to clean that up.
Right. And then talk about education is really important here, because it's not just thinking about reading and writing, but it's 4 cases kind of faded away. But in 1821, a woman named Hester Davis is arguing again that she has indigenous background and she should have the right to, now her enslaver is James Allen. And I wondered about Hester and Esther of the previous case. Esther had permission to interview a Catherine Edwards who was located in Ohio as part of gathering information about her case in 1793 to establish her lineage and background. My suspicion is that Esther is Hester, and Esther had to wait 20 years before she could try to make her claim again in court in Loudoun County. And I know Eric is thinking about this. We're all going, wait a minute, let's look at that again. So here is Hester's, here is one of those initial court orders. We think this may have been written out by her lawyer, but the language here is really revealing that she has a reason for why she should be free, that she is descended in the maternal line of a Native American Indian named, and they didn't even fill it in. Maybe
Probably
she doesn't
a
know.
significant person.
Yes.
A significant person, but unable to communicate that across the language barrier.
And that she is, her charge here is not that she's enslaved, but that she's illegally deported. And at the bottom is this interesting little signature here, right? Is this Hester's signature? Usually when a person, if they don't know how to sign their name, they will make their mark, an X or some other kind of notation, and that is included in that document. But we don't see that here. So there's the question of, was Hester able to write her own name? It adds to that question about education. Well, so in all of the documents that are created, and there's at least 94, probably 100 pages or more outside of Princeton by the Skillman family. And just before the Revolutionary War, probably 1769 or 1770, the Skillmans, the Beekmans, the Allens are all coming from New Jersey into Loudoun County. And remember, Skillmans and Allens are the same people who were enslaving those 4 women that earlier said they were of indigenous background. Once they was able to call on witnesses from these different families who knew her grandparents and who knew that her grandparents were probably people named Cuff, a woman named Cuff, but they couldn't be sure what her heritage was. And so some of the questions that come up in here get us a sense of, again, what the evidentiary proof was required. They wanted to know if they had ever heard Hester's ancestor called an Indian, generally by members of the neighborhood, by the community, if they had that communal memory of her identity. They wanted Curly, and that was crucial evidence. They wanted to know if Coff's mother was an Indian or a mulatto. Was she of African descent or was she of indigenous descent? And did that indigenous descent come from her mother or from her father? One of the defendant's witnesses said that they knew the story that Coff had come from Madagascar, and that's how they came to New Jersey as enslaved. And there was a thriving trade between Madagascar and New Jersey. But it didn't help settle Hester's case. Interestingly enough, the jury could not make a decision on Hester's status that day. The jury is going back and forth. They're kind of a hung jury. They can't decide whether, yes, she should be free or she shouldn't. And so finally they reach out to the lawyers and say, well, could we just remove one of the jurors and make it easier to decide? Counsel said, okay, we're all right with that, so someday. And those jurors were tired and they said, could we recess? And there was some discussion among the lawyers, the Commonwealth attorney, the defending lawyer, about whether they could be whether they could leave. Well, they were supposed to be accompanied by an officer of the court, so they wouldn't be chattering about this outside of the court property. That didn't happen. And the next day when these jurors reconvened in the courthouse, their opinion was in favor of the enslaver, that Hester didn't have the necessary proof to establish her freedom. Hester's lawyer immediately went into action and said, we want to show that we place an exception to this ruling. And that ruling then went forward out of the county court that they are trying to issue a writ so that the enslaver cannot take her and then sell her away, that they're going to hold everything until another further appeal can be made. That's agreed upon, and then that motion is quashed. And we don't know what happened after that. We're still looking to see if we can find records of Hester.
Now we're going to talk about some Indigenous identity and advocacy. And
I think, as I wrap up from the documents here, that unlike enslaved people, we're often thinking about seeking freedom by running away. That Indigenous people were often really powerful in the courts, and especially the women, because they're using their knowledge of their Native American ancestry to make a claim to freedom in court, using the colonial and state records to their advantage. They cultivated those relationships with whites who could support their claims in court. They made, and most importantly, they preserved their identity through family history. This really shows us the tenacity of Indigenous people to fight for their freedom. We show that importance of transmitting knowledge, not just education, but knowledge about family and the court and the law. And we see the use of the courts that were using that to protect the rights that they knew that they could claim. And so freedom suits are just one example of the long tradition of advocacy by Indigenous women and Indigenous people.
This is a slide showing the tribes of Virginia. So these are the tribes that are state recognized, federally recognized, and other. They're divided up into the Pocahontas. She was a child. She became pregnant by a white man. Her story became a stereotype of sexualized, romanticized, sensation. The white man's reaction, I believe, of this old story, this is my experience, is that it justifies for a white man to take a Native girl or a Native woman. It's justified. And it substantiates that our Native girls and our Native women are objects of curiosity, objects of desire, and can be owned or can be used because that's the history. I feel like in my experience and some of my other Indigenous friends' experience with the white woman's reaction to Pocahontas is that they see that Pocahontas is associated with and the beauty that's associated with Pocahontas. And then our little girls are encouraged to wear costumes at Halloween of the little Pocahontas woodland princess. All of this is part of the sexualized extension of slavery, I believe, and part of the countless problems that we Indigenous women, and I was wearing a ribbon skirt. I didn't even have my feathers on. I was a dear friend of ours in the community. I went to his funeral, and this older white gentleman came up to me, and he said, "You're Indian, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I am." And he whispered to me, he said, "If I was a little younger, I'd get me one." Whispers. But I can tell you that there's a missing, murdered Indigenous women crisis in this country right now. Our Native American women are being ripped out of our communities and disappearing. It's been happening before my lifetime and to my lifetime today. I've been present when someone's daughter went missing while I'm sitting at my dining table. It's that prevalent. My tribe is one of the hot spots for this because we're off I-95 and there's hot spots across the country. So I believe the results of the sexualized Pocahontas feeds into that stereotype. It destabilizes our Indigenous women's matrilineal societies and our roles that we've had. It distorts us as sex objects. It reduces us and erodes our cultural respect and our authority. It impacts our women's status in our communities. It disrupts our social structures in our communities. It obscures our rich culture and our heritage. And it diminishes our complex roles as Indigenous women, contributions and our authority as leaders in our community, as change makers in our community, and as sacred life bearers of our children. Undermining our rhetoric, and the sexual pleasure of others. Could we go to the next slide? Unless you'd like to add anything to that, I'd like to talk a little bit about in today in this country. It's called the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. I've graduated from there at least 3 times. Any of you can graduate from there too if you want to take a class. We have doctors, lawyers, and Indian chiefs graduating from our university. One person is a lawyer, and her name is Arlinda Locklear. She is a Native American Lumbee woman, and she was the first lawyer, Native American lawyer, to go before the Supreme Court on behalf of Indigenous peoples. She is working across this country to help our Indigenous people, and I'm proud to call her one of my Lumbee sisters. You can open up for
Yeah, so
questions.
I think in closing, we come to history through colonized records. And we hope that by starting this conversation, that this is just a start to the conversation. And as Lori mentioned, we'd love for you to sign up to get more information from Lori and Oatlands about this and to view the documents that come from our historical site and to keep in touch with the Black Committee at Balch Library and these other resources that are out there. These are incredible ways that you can continue on this work that has begun.
If you look at the land acknowledgement statement that's in your chair, there's call to actions. There's things that you can do. You can go to a powwow. Those tribes in Virginia, they have powwows. You're invited. You can go and learn about our culture, meet our people. You can plant nut trees. We need lots of nut trees. You can put your feet in the ground, in the grass, and ground yourself and can reconnect yourself to Mother Earth. There's different things in there that you can do. So please, thank you for receiving the information that we provided today, but we hope that it doesn't stop here, that you share with others much more to tell you about. So I think this is a good time to ask, if you do have questions, yes? We have a microphone.
What do you know about the mindset of the abolitionists and warriors that advocated for the peoples in the stories you share? Why did they do it? Was it the same as for African American slaves, or was there a different understanding of the rightful freedoms of slaves?
That's a great question about the mindset of the abolition societies and other friends who are trying to help people make their claims to freedom in court. Quaker faith, people of the Methodist faith are petitioning to the governor, petitioning to the legislature, asking for some kind of emancipation, some kind of end to enslavement. So the discussion about ending enslavement does not just come from these abolition societies, it's also deeply rooted in religion. And the 1782 law in Virginia stated that now, probably if you had done some incredible meritorious act, or if you had the permission of the legislature to free an individual, the 1782 law allowed an individual enslaver to write a deed of freedom, a deed of manumission, or to set in their will manumission for any enslaved person. So these abolition societies really, I think, grew up out of this heartfelt belief that slavery was wrong. That there was this idea of liberty and freedom for all mankind, that all people had a natural right to be free. And they're trying to take that belief and put it into action. And they're forming, the fact that they could form a huge society in Winchester, which speaks to the power that these influencers had. These are the friends that were friends, right?
And probably neighbors.
Right.
Because I know we had white neighbors living next door to us, and they have empathy and understanding that we're just people who are trying to make a living, and trying to have babies and live our life and be left alone. So there's an empathy, and they helped us get money, grants from the state, and maneuver systems that we're not familiar with. So it's great that we have people like that, and probably everybody in this room is on our side and here to help us take a stand if we need you.
So part of our oral history, the African slaves actually took in Indian different tribes into the family, and they actually grew up with us. And not recently, but my mother used to say that she would look out the window and they had mounds, and they would actually still, when she was younger, still doing their powwow and doing so forth. One of the questions I have is, are they doing a DNA project? In our DNA, we have an American Indian background, both me and my husband, but it's like a brick wall.
I'd like to respond to that too. We both can. A lot of Native American people don't trust the DNA process for many reasons. In order to validate the information that you're Native American, you have to have Native American DNA in that system to validate that. Getting any positive results, because we don't want to go in there and put our data in there. And if we do, how do we know that it's not being skewed in one way or another? There's a trust system there, a failure of trust there. And So that's, I'm not aware of an Indigenous Native American DNA project. I am aware of the blood quantum requirement that has been put on us by the United States government. We're the only people that I know of that our identity is proven by the blood that runs through our veins. And there's a blood test. You've got to be quarter this, a percentage of that. And over time, the goal of the government is to dilute that so that there would be lower numbers on purpose. But I believe that the idea of race is a European construct that was put on us because we would adopt people into our tribe and not worry about what color they were, or if they had curly hair, or the pencil stuck in it or not. We adopted each other. So that was a long story, more than you asked me, but I just wanted to vent that out.
Speaking of that construct, it's quite interesting that they don't talk a lot about before coming to this country. In antiquity, there was never anybody known as a white person or a black person. It was more about classes and maybe geographical representation. But that seems to squash the notion of a race, because prior to the Lincoln Rebellion, white a lot of things, and so all of a sudden they put this layer on. Even the geographical Virginia is now known as the state of Virginia, or the Commonwealth of Virginia, which is a legal setting, right? It's more of a legal term that men use.
Yeah, I think the construction of race in an economic setting, the construction of case of race in a legal setting. And certainly before English are making their claims in Virginia, the Spanish had already, were trying to grapple with this question in the 1500s with their slave trade and their slave colonies in the Americas. And the Spanish developed a casta system, or like a caste system. And this was often transmitted through visual representations of artwork that would explain what happens if you have a Spaniard who is intermarried with a Native American woman. What is their child status? What would that child be called? If you have an African man who has a child with a white woman, what is that child going to be called or identified as? And so there were at least, some of the casta systems, 16 different kinds of pairings and groupings. And for the Spanish, at least, this was an effort to give a name for that Spanish casta system. So English in Virginia they're trying to catch up with the Spanish and the Portuguese, who already had much longer established systems of slavery and much more established justifications for enslavement. So the English is trying to sort of figure out how they're going to maybe learn from some of the other colonized.
And a youth, when you get your driver's license, on my driver's license it had an O for other in North Carolina. And I had that because we didn't have an I yet. I didn't get an I for my driver's license until I joined the military in the 1980s. And I also wanted to say for Virginia, a challenge that the Native Americans in Virginia face is in the 19Virginia. Dr. Walter Plecker was a white supremacist leader who wanted a pure race in Virginia, which was part of the movement back then in this country. And he had all the Native American records in Virginia destroyed. And he had, if you were Native American in Virginia, you had to choose. You could be colored or white. Adolf Hitler learned from the United States. You can look that one up.
We've got a couple of questions here. Sir, yeah.
Hi, first of all, it's a great presentation.
Thank you.
I have a quick question. If I were an Indigenous person around 1740 to 1780, would I have a preference on France versus British or colonial? Would I feel that one of those three would be better for me than the other? Or would I not care?
Mm-hmm.
You would care, and you could change your mind tomorrow. you can care today because it's in my best interest and my family's best interest today, then I will partner with them instead.
Okay. Yeah.
We owe no allegiance to foreign countries when you're trying to survive in your own country, in your own family, your own tribe. And I think it would be the same if it was reversed.
Yeah.
In terms of enslavement, the French, what is now Louisiana, New Orleans, and so those laws there gave more freedoms and more rights to the free people of color. And so Native Americans may have filtered into that segment of the population more easily in French-controlled territory. English weren't, they were more interested, I think, in a biracial kind of system. Yeah.
One more thing about Dr. Plecker. He brought our Indigenous women in, and I'm trying to be careful and sensitive because we have the ability to have children. That was part of that 40-year period. And when she left the doctor's office, she didn't know. I've met women who didn't know why they couldn't have children until they found that historical fact out.
We'll come to you, Alicia.
This is a little in the weeds, and I'm sorry, I don't recall the person's name who's enslaved. They were from the Princeton area of New Jersey. I'm sorry? Hesterman? Hester, thank you. That's great. With the Haudenosaunee and then West Princeton. So clearly that's an indication of where a community had settled for some time.
And I think that the question about whether they could have been part of an indigenous group that had migrated north and west and further places, that's a great question. Those are one of those things we would love to know as historians and as cultural heritage keepers. And all we're left with are these threads, these shards of information, right? Testimony from relatives or descendants of the Skillmans of New Jersey. Their understanding could have been maybe they didn't know if that person was indigenous because they weren't told that person was indigenous, or it didn't come through an indigenous trade network if they're not trading. An interesting question that comes up in some of these cases is if the person who is giving testimony about seeing a Native American person. So the people in New Jersey are actually, and you might be onto something here because they did say, yes, I had seen numerous. There's other witnesses in Virginia who said, I've never seen a Native American person, but this is what I know about what they should look like. So that kind of knowledge also trade out of Madagascar to New Jersey. So there's that possibility also. Some of the stories of other freedom cases that come out, one that came out of Henry County, sort of in this area as well. The enslavers, perhaps as they were getting older and recognizing they needed to meet their maker, decided to inform one of their enslaved women that she was descended from someone who was indigenous and said, I think you have a claim to your freedom and here's why. And he stole 2 indigenous children while their father was fishing. And he had to hide out for a couple of weeks so he wouldn't be followed or attacked, because he knew he had taken them. He had actually taken 5 people. 3 of them died on the way. And those 2 children survived, and they stayed with that Clay family as it came to Virginia. And that's how the members in that family are taking their claims to court, is because their enslavers are telling their sons, and the son is telling them, these enslaved people, that they knew their family history. So to Renee's point about children being kidnapped as children, how long could they maintain that culture without the support, without the guidance of their mother, without the protection of their father to keep it alive? Yeah.
My great-grandmother was an orphan. She was picking strawberries along the roadside, and this native family came by and saw her picking strawberries. And she went over and she had somebody who wants some strawberries, and the people said, we'll be back tomorrow, but that's not that much. You need to have more strawberries than that. And so the next day they came by on the dirt road, and she was there with a whole bunch of strawberries. And they picked her up. My great-grandmother into their family and helped raise her. And then, so when that happened, that was happening. It's happened to us, and I'm a witness here to say that it happens.
Alicia, you had a question?
Yeah, mine isn't a question, but it's more to inform the public that there is a Native American university system. Can you, Rene, address some of the schools that are around so others might know?
Okay. There's Native American, your question is about Native American institutions.
Yes.
There's more out west than there are here in the east. My university is one of the few Native universities here on the East Coast. I've been working with Shenandoah University about adding a class, a Native American class, to their curriculum at Shenandoah University about Virginia Native history, Virginia's Indigenous history. It's really hard to find. Like, I would like to have a PhD in American Indian Studies. It's hard to find. It's something buried under Department of Agriculture in gardening and farming or something like that. It's really hard to find. There are Indian studies, and so I can't give you a long list. It's not a long list. But the fact that my university has an American Indian Studies degree, undergrad degree, and now it's online, is graduated last December. And so we proved that it could be done. We were the guinea pigs. And now anybody can take that degree online from across the country, which is significant. So we're making some movements, but it's very slow. It's very expensive to create curriculum, I learned.
Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to learn more about the Indigenous.
I would like to.
Yes,
there you go.
My name is Rene. I'm with the Loudoun Heritage Farm Museum in Sterling. We're in Locklear Park. We opened an exhibit this past summer, Loudoun's First Farmers. A portion of that exhibit is in the other room in a map case, but really quite accurately. It's taken us 10,000 years to put together that exhibit because we have artifacts going back that far. I had absolutely nothing to do with building the exhibit other than the wall structure that it lives on. But it's a pretty impressive exhibit. I would invite you to come down.
Yes. The case that you have that's in the room, exhibit with the community in Bluemont on Snickersville Turnpike at the E.E. Lake store. It's a plaster museum. It's 2 small rooms, but 17,000 years of history that we have in there. And thanks to the loan of your case, that was a significant contribution to that exhibit. And it's up until the end of this month by reservation. If you want to go, I'll give you a private tour, but you've got to call us to schedule it. But we've been up all year, and it's been very popular. I was interviewed by a Spanish radio going to run in Spain. So I asked her about Christopher Columbus. Don't sit down yet. But I asked her about Christopher Columbus because Spain paid for that, right? And she said, I said, what are they teaching in Spain about Christopher Columbus? And she said that they're teaching, brought like a word associated with money and things to the world, like brought prosperity to the world. I'm like, so she said they're trying to use more decolonized language now in Spain to just exhibit.
I will add that our exhibit is permanent. It's going to be there for years, I would hope. We're open Tuesday through Sunday, closed on Mondays, but please do come down and visit us.
Yes. I would like to say something about his exhibit and the years. Let's say there's 12 months in a year, right? There's 13 moons in a year. So let's pretend I've got an extra finger. There's 13 moons in a year, and every moon cycle is 1,000 years. The story started on the half moon of the last cycle, around December 15. So from December 15 to December 31st, that's all of American history. We don't talk about the other moon cycles and the other. So your museum helps tell that longer story, which is really important to say we've been here a long time.
So that's so amazing because even the name Christopher Columbus is not right. It's Cristobal Colon, and he's coming out of Italy, right, to do work with the Spain, right? And we've heard that France is having an issue with their colonization over North Africa. You heard the story last year to you. They're complaining not getting the money. No, Italy was once colonizing too. So they're now grappling with each other over
Pushing them, starting to push the colonizers out.
They are.
Wow.
Yeah, they are. As they call it. Sierra Leone said, you all have to get out of here because you're devaluating our money system over the dollar.
Okay.
1,500.
Well, there's so much we could talk about.
I know, another plug for why we take history courses.
I know.
Why we take a lot of
How much
history
more
courses.
time do we have? So we could.
Did you address the Indian mound that is here on 15? And are there ever any ceremonies that we could attend there, or what is the history of it?
So she's asking a question about a mound that's believed to be an Indian mound here, and there's a lot of stories behind that mound. The Oatlands actually formed a committee here, and so we have been working with Indigenous to meet and talk about that. Preliminary research indicates that it's a natural formation that came off the mountain. But that doesn't mean it wasn't sacred, or that it might have been used for ceremony or something. But we are still working on that. We just met recently, actually, about that. Thank you for asking. Yeah. Yes. Oh, I think you.
Go ahead.
I read your land acknowledgement, and one of the things that struck me was the state advocacy, which reminded me I visited the State Americans that has exhibits to tell their long natural human history. So my question to you is, do you have good, strong allies at the state government level, or is that hard to do because you're relatively small? What gives you hope to increase such awareness and education?
I live in this area, but I feel very alone oftentimes. And there's a lot of us, but we need more people helping us. So, or you know someone who's an advocate who would like to help us with things. My husband and I have a nonprofit. We don't pay ourselves. Our life work is helping leaders bring recognition to the contributions that we work with the tribes, but each tribe still needs a lot of work. Virginia's tribes just got federally recognized. Everybody knows Pocahontas, but the tribes weren't even recognized until not long ago. So yes, we do need more advocacy at all levels, the legal level, financial. I talked with someone yesterday, maybe they're in this room, told me about 2 tribes in Virginia that aren't even recognized, and they're trying to figure out this process. That's another story. I got so many things to talk about. Thank you for asking that. If you want to talk about that more later, I'd love to hear what you're really thinking there.
Okay, I just wanted to thank you for mentioning the sources you've had, because I've done a lot of research on the Black history of Huerta and heard families say, yes, so-and-so, old woman, long, straight, black hair. We thought she was Indian, but that's as far as they knew. So it sounds as if the information is there, if I look. And another thing, you talked about the sexual violence in the U.S. Tremendous amount of it in Canada that is made much more public. I hear about it on radio.
Yes.
And I hadn't heard it so much about the U.S.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
sorry to hear that.
We're working, we have agencies that are working. President Trump was one of the first to make an effort to create a committee for missing, murdered, and Indigenous to try to connect our policing system so the systems can communicate. Because when you're on a reservation, you have native police system. But that system may not talk to the outside system. So if someone comes on a reservation and takes, I have a friend of mine, her sister went missing back in the 70s or it would have been in the 80s. And my best friend and I wanted to recognize and honor her sister's case by putting her case number on a document, because we want to have some some classes to teach self-defense or something, you know, something, do something. She went to the police office to get the case number so we could put it on our poster. There was no case number. There was never a case. There was no investigation. Her family's been waiting all these years for answers. That's someone I know. And there's so many that I don't know that that's happening to.
One more question? Yeah. Anybody else?
There's one there too.
Okay, I'll make this quick. I think I did see in US Today.
It sounds like it's associated with the missing murdered Indigenous women and children issue. And there's a red dress. And there's also a red handprint. So if you see someone wearing a red handprint on their face, that's what it means. We're trying to bring a recognition in different ways, and that's one way. We had a red dress art installation in the forest at the Bluemont Fair 1 year. Powerful. Yeah. But then what? And then what? And then what? You know, and that's where we need the advocacies to help us with this problem. There's also, I've talked to the person who's leading that project for the country, and there's also missing boys and missing men. And sometimes when someone is reported missing, if there are runaway numbers too, and well, why is she running away every month? Can somebody look into that? You know, instead of just managing that number of how many runaways. There's a lot of problems at a lot of levels. It has a lot to do with jurisdiction too. That was a point I didn't make. On the reservation, there's jurisdiction of who has jurisdiction, legal jurisdiction on that reservation, and then who has jurisdiction once a person leaves outside the reservation. There's jurisdiction issues. It's complicated.
My question was, were the Indigenous children in Virginia and North Carolina forced into the so-called Indian schools?
Yes. Pennsylvania, yeah, the boarding school, Carlisle School. A lot of our people here have been sent to Carlisle Indian boarding school, and also some of from my tribe were sent up here to the Indian boarding school in Virginia. And I believe there's also a black boarding school in Virginia, and then they had the native boarding school in Pennsylvania. We may have had some folks sent to that boarding school as well. And those of you who don't know, the boarding school was a place where our Indian children were taken from their families and sent to a school to assimilate, and with forced learning language, English, couldn't speak their language, had to cut their hair, and many of them died. And they have massive graves at some of the boarding schools. And our people are trying to get their remains back so we can bring them back home. So there is some DNA testing involved in some of those remains to identify which tribe they belong to.
Thank you all for coming. I think you have a few minutes to hang around, and also, again, please go look at the exhibits in the other room straight across through the gift shop. Our partners are set up in there. Also, you can see the traveling exhibit from the Loudoun Heritage Farm Museum. So thank you again, everybody, for coming. Please sign up so I can send you. Thank you.